really, when China's exports to the U.S. account for 2, maximum 3% of GDP, yeah, they're going to take a hit, but I mean, they're going to be able to make it up the same way they made it up by rerouting during Trump's first term. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think, as you said, like if you look at the direct export from China to the U.S., you're talking about, whatever, 15% of total exports, okay, which is about 2% of GDP. However, if you look at the indirect exports to the U.S. from China via the likes of Mexico, Vietnam, Indonesia, and where else, you're talking about more like 5% of GDP. And actually, it's about 10% of total industrial production. And that would be a very big hit because at this level of tariff, you're talking about Chinese export to the U.S., it's going to go to zero. I mean, in fact, I actually think the reason why the Chinese hit back as hard as they did in terms of retaliatory response is because they realized that this is not a trade war, that this is a declaration of war against China. Because I think that this was always designed to decimate China's basic export to the U.S., but more importantly, to destroy China's economy. Because I actually think that since we last spoke, I think the DeepSeek news has only increased the urgency. I mean, I think in Washington among the China hawks, that this is a time to settle our differences with China finally in order to avert what the U.S. perceives as an existential threat. So I think the architects of Trump's trade war was always designing this trade war to actually stop China from, essentially, threatening U.S. hegemony, if you like. And this is why I think the Chinese don't want to talk. They feel that, wow, this is much more than I think they expected coming to this new presidency. And this is why this thing is dragging into a war of attrition. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, so a lot more than expected. They're not taking a lying down. They're retaliating and hitting the U.S. back hard. You also think that Trump is trying to isolate China, right? But how can it be when we've been watching Xi Jinping on this whistle-stop tour through Southeast Asia, picking up, among other things, and this is the thing that's catching my eye, places like Vietnam, I'm not sure what their Boeing order books look like, right? But they're starting to buy Chinese Comac aircraft, and that could potentially become a trend.
Exactly. You know what, Martin, this is, for me, the most interesting thing is this, right? I mean, if you say, okay, if we sit here and say, wow, what has Trump exactly achieved? Because the stock market's gone down, the economy is about to go into recession. I mean, it seems that Trump is basically, essentially firing at will, but not achieving very much. But I would argue that if there's one result that Trump has achieved so far, is by isolating China. And what do I mean by that? This is actually very, very important. Because, in fact, if you think about this, Xi Jinping's trip to Southeast Asia does not change the fundamental fact that China is the only country in the world that has retaliated against the U.S. tariff. That actually went into effect last week, the 10%, if you remember, okay, despite the pause. The fact is that I can't believe, so he's going to Vietnam and Malaysia, which makes sense, okay? But Cambodia, please do me a favor. You have to be really desperate to go to Cambodia right now because that's just a completely insignificant country from the point of view of economically for China, for that matter. What about Thailand? What about Indonesia, which is the biggest economy? The fact is that the Indian Minister of Commerce came out saying last week that this is an opportunity of a lifetime for India, Trump's trade war. He's basically blaming unfair Chinese practices for basically this trade war. You've got Australia that is basically saying that we don't want the hand of friendship. Even the Japanese and the South Koreans deny, okay, the rumor that there were discussions with the Chinese about joint, basically coordinated actions, or even for that matter, discussion about free trade. From that point of view, I think, China is truly isolated right now. And that is very, very interesting. And I think from that point of view, this is probably the reason why the U.S. thinks it's got this upper hand, that they have closed off China's backdoors to the U.S. They've isolated China. But I think, the fact that China's isolated does not mean we'll give up.